By the time the red engine drew in its breath and let it out again in a shuddering plume of white steam, Harry Potter had the peculiar feeling that he had already stepped out of the known world and into some older country where rules might be written in iron instead of ink. The platform was crowded, yet it did not feel crowded in the ordinary way. It felt ceremonial. Owls rustled in wicker cages and looked disdainfully upon the milling families. Cats wound between trunks stamped with brass initials. Mothers made last adjustments to collars and cuffs, as if the children they were sending off were pages bound for court, rather than 11-year-olds with scuffed shoes and ink stains on their fingers. The air smelled of coal, cold metal, wet wool, and something else, something bright and impossible, that Harry had come to think of as magic itself. He might never have found the train at all if not for the red-haired woman who said, with a kindness so matter-of-fact it embarrassed him, "First year? You'd better come with us, dear." The Dursleys had left him with less ceremony than they would have given an unwanted parcel, and the sudden practical warmth of Molly Weasley had unsettled him more than Uncle Vernon's sneers ever could. She had shown him the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, and Harry had obeyed because she sounded like a person one obeyed when one wanted to keep from looking foolish. He ran straight at solid brick and found it soft as a curtain. A heartbeat later he was here, in the smoke and thunder, with his trunk rattling at his knees, and his owl giving an offended ruffle behind him. There were too many Weasleys to keep count of at once. Two of the older boys, twins by the look of them, had stared at his scar, then at him, then at each other with the barely leashed delight of people who had stumbled upon a particularly choice joke and were for once decent enough not to make it aloud. Another boy, lankier and younger than the twins, stood at his mother's side with an expression midway between dread and wonder. "This is Ron," she had told Harry, and Ron Weasley had gone pink as though being introduced were an ordeal only slightly less painful than dragon pox. Now they sat opposite each other in a compartment with the window cracked to the autumn chill, the countryside beginning to unspool beyond the glass in long strips of gold and green. Ron's nose was smudged faintly black at one side, perhaps from the engine, or perhaps because it belonged to a household where people were too busy to fuss over such things. He stared at Harry's trunk, at Harry's owl, at the packet of chocolate frogs between them, and finally admitted with a sort of abrupt honesty Harry found immediately preferable to Dudley's boasting. "I've never had this much to myself at school. Everything's secondhand. Even my wand was Charlie's old one." Harry thought of his own school things, most of them Dudley's cast-offs, stretched or stained or missing buttons, and said before he could stop himself, "Most of mine were too." Ron looked up sharply, as if expecting mockery, and found none. Something eased in his face. Harry pushed the cartload of sweets he had bought at the trolley witch toward the middle seat. "Help yourself." Ron did, though with a politeness that clearly fought years of wanting. In return, he explained between mouthfuls of pumpkin pasty that all the Wesleys had been in Gryffindor, and that his brothers claimed Hogwarts staircases changed on purpose when they smelled fear. He described professors Harry had not yet met as if reciting a half-loved, half-dreaded family legend. There was a giant gamekeeper called Hagrid who could bend guns like toys. There was an old transfiguration professor who could turn into a tabby cat. There was a headmaster who was either the greatest wizard alive or a brilliant lunatic, depending on whether one asked Percy or Fred. "And there's Slytherin," Ron said, lowering his voice as though the word itself might slither under the door and listen. "That's where all the rotten ones go." Harry, who had heard a very similar sentiment from Hagrid in Diagon Alley, looked out at the fields but did not answer at once. The name still carried with it the memory of a pale boy in Madame Malkin's robe shop, standing on the fitting stool as if he had been born to elevation. That boy had spoken carelessly of houses and blood, and the kinds of people one ought not to make friends with. Harry had disliked him instantly, and yet there had been something in the ease of his belonging, in the assumption that the world would open for him, that had lodged under Harry's skin like a splinter. Harry had spent 10 years being told where to stand, how much to speak, what scraps were his. The thought of being placed anywhere by something older and stranger than the Dursleys made a tightness gather at the base of his throat. The compartment door slid open with a scrape. The pale boy from the robe shop stood there, one hand still on the handle, with two broader boys looming behind him like hired muscle in a storybook. He looked even fairer in the train light, his hair the precise color of burnished straw, his mouth curved in that way which suggested he often found the world slightly beneath him. He let his eyes move over Harry, then dropped them to Ron's hand-me-down robes and the sweets scattered over the seat. The smile sharpened. "I thought it was you," he said. "The scar's hard to miss." Ron stiffened at once, and something in Harry stiffened in answer. Yet the boy's gaze had not the gawping awe of the people in the leaky cauldron. It was assessing, cool, as if Harry were not a miracle but a figure newly entered onto a board whose arrangement mattered. "Draco Malfoy," he said, not offering his hand so much as bestowing his name. "These are Crabbe and Goyle." Ron made a sound halfway to a snort. Malfoy's gray eyes flicked to him. "Red hair and a hand-me-down wand," he said. "You must be a Weasley." "I can tell who you are without asking too," Ron retorted, ears going red again. "My dad said all the Malfoys have been bad for generations." Crabbe and Goyle laughed dutifully. Malfoy did not. He kept watching Harry. "You'll learn," he said softly, "that some wizarding families are better than others. Hogwarts is easier if you understand that straight away." Then, with an abrupt change of tone that might have passed for friendliness if he had not chosen to make it before witnesses, "You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there." The offer hung in the compartment like a coin held between finger and thumb. Harry saw the contempt in it and disliked that. He saw the certainty too, the assumption that he could simply step into a circle and be guarded by it, and that he understood better. Ron glared at Malfoy with the helpless fury of someone used to being sneered at by people with better robes and cleaner cuffs. Harry felt, in one strange flash, that the next sentence he chose might matter long after the train had reached the castle. "I reckon I can tell the wrong sort for myself," he said. It was not as cutting as the answer he might have given an hour earlier. He heard that himself. So did Malfoy. The fair brows rose slightly, not in offense but in interest. "Can you?" Malfoy said. "Well, we'll see." He shut the door with exaggerated care. Crabbe and Goyle lumbered after him. For a moment, the compartment seemed larger and colder. Ron let out a breath. "He's horrible." Harry smiled faintly, but his thoughts did not settle. Horrible, yes, but there had been no uncertainty in Malfoy. Harry had never yet met a boy who sounded so certain that the world had room waiting for him. A little later, Hermione Granger appeared in the doorway, crisp already in her black school robes, with a round-faced boy behind her who looked fit to cry. She was in search of a toad, though she seemed less concerned by its loss than by the incompetence of the people who had lost it. Harry saw immediately that she was the kind of person to be right often and to mind very much when others failed to notice. Ron appeared to decide in that same instant that she was intolerable. Harry, who had lived too long among people who wielded certainty like a cudgel, was not sure what he thought. By the time the sky darkened and the lamps within the train came on in shivering pools of yellow, the chatter in the corridor had turned almost entirely toward Hogwarts. Houses, classes, ghosts, staircases, secret passages, Quidditch, punishments, prefects. Every older student seemed to remember their first arrival with relish. Harry changed into his robes with fingers that had begun to feel clumsy. When he looked at himself in the reflected dark of the window, small and black-clad and bright-eyed, he thought for one alarming second that he looked like a person from a story. Not the hero of one. He did not yet know enough to imagine himself that, but at least someone who might be written down and kept. Then the train slowed. A cry went up along the corridor. Harry pressed close to the glass. Across a dark stretch of water rose the castle, all towers and lit windows an impossible height, each window throwing gold onto the black lake below, like a promise no one had made to him, and yet which he found himself wanting, with almost painful force. He heard Ron breathe, "Blimey," and felt the same word strike the inside of his chest. Somewhere ahead, in that vast place of stone and candlelight and old names, something was waiting to tell him where he belonged. If the train platform had felt ceremonial, the first sight of the Great Hall felt judicial. Harry had followed the other first years across the Black Lake in small boats that rocked under the weight of children and trunks and nerves, with Hagrid's great shape booming directions from somewhere behind them. The castle had towered above, drawing nearer until the smallest windows became arches, and the arches became doors, and the doors swallowed them whole. Then there were corridors of torchlight, stones slick with age, ceilings so high they vanished into dark, the first whisper of ghosts, drifting pale as cobwebs through walls that seemed older than memory. By the time Professor McGonagall, sharp-faced, tartan-robed, and every inch as formidable as Ron's brothers had promised, lined them up outside the hall and informed them that the sorting was a solemn and ancient tradition, Harry no longer felt like a boy on the verge of school. He felt like a supplicant in an old kingdom. The doors opened. Everything at once was too much, and not enough. Floating candles burned under a ceiling that was not a ceiling at all, but an October sky alive with stars. 4 long house tables stretched beneath banners of scarlet, blue, yellow, and green. Silver dishes flashed. Goblets winked. Hundreds of faces turned toward the newest arrivals and sharpened into curiosity, amusement, boredom, hunger, indifference, delight. There were ghosts drifting among the students with the air of old courtiers who had died but not quite retired. At the high table the teachers sat in a line, black, plum, emerald, and midnight blue, and in the center of them a white-bearded old man watched the room with such twinkling interest that Harry could not immediately decide whether he looked benign or dangerous. Before the stool sat the hat. Harry had known there would be a hat, because older students on the train had said so, but knowledge was not the same as seeing it. It was patched and battered and looked as though it ought to be thrown out, yet the entire hall had gone still before it. When the split near its brim opened and it began to sing, Harry felt the skin at his arms tighten under his sleeves. The song was of the 4 founders, the houses they built, and the virtues each prized. Gryffindor the bold, Ravenclaw the wise, Hufflepuff the true, Slytherin the resourceful and great. Great, Harry noticed. Not wicked. Not dark. Hagrid had said there wasn't a witch or wizard who went bad who wasn't in Slytherin, but the hat itself made no mention of evil. It spoke of ambition, cunning, fraternity, and blood of old renown. A house like a blade could be, useful, dangerous, beautiful, depending on the hand that held it. Names began. Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, Terry Boot. The hall clapped, laughed, sighed. Children went stumbling or floating to one table or another. Hermione Granger scarcely touched the stool before the hat cried, "Gryffindor," as though relieved to be done with her. Ron, pale with dread, got the same, and the Weasley twins at the far end of the table whooped until McGonagall quelled them with a look. Draco Malfoy was sorted into Slytherin so quickly the hat barely had time to settle over his pale hair. He crossed to the green-draped table with the composure of a young lord receiving his birthright. When he sat, he glanced back at Harry once, and there was something in the look that was not a jeer, and not an invitation, but prediction. At last McGonagall called, "Potter, Harry!" The silence that followed was not quite silence. It had too many breaths in it, too many whispers. Harry walked to the stool, feeling every eye in the room strike against him like sleet. He sat. The hat came down over his face. The hall vanished into darkness, smelling faintly of dust and old wool. "Well, well," said a voice inside his head, quick and intimate as a thought he had not chosen. Difficult. Very difficult. Harry gripped the sides of the stool. "Plenty of courage, I see. Not a little mind either. A thirst to prove yourself. Yes, very strong. And what is this? A talent for survival. A knack for secrecy. You have learned already how to endure in small spaces and keep your feelings hidden. admirable in its way. Harry swallowed. Hagrid's rough voice seemed to rise from memory. There wasn't a single witch or wizard who went bad who wasn't in Slytherin. Not Slytherin, Harry thought at once, and the thought burst louder than he intended in the dark behind his eyes. The hat gave a dry little sound that might have been amusement. No? You are certain because of something half heard from people who fear what they do not understand. Your choices will matter, yes, but so will what you are. There is ambition in you, child. And hurt. Hurt makes very sharp tools. I'm not bad, Harry thought, the desperation of it shaming him. Neither is the knife, said the hat. Yet it cuts. Harry could not breathe properly. The darkness under the brim felt close and private, as if the hat had found not merely his thoughts, but the cupboards and stairwells inside him where fear had lived for years. He thought of Privet Drive, of Dudley's gang in the park, of Petunia's pinched mouth, of Vernon's roaring certainty that power belonged by nature to men like him. He thought of Malfoy on the train, so sure he had a place at a table in any room worth entering. He thought of Ron's casual, that's where all the rotten ones go, as though Harry himself could not possibly be one of them. Underneath all that ran something stranger and more humiliating, a hot and helpless wish never again to be pushed into a corner by people who knew exactly where they belonged. You could be great, you know, murmured the hat. Not good in the shallow way children mean, but great. Slytherin would help you on the road to greatness. Harry had the wild urge to tear it off. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, another feeling stirred. Not desire exactly. Recognition. The hat had not named anything in him that felt false. Ambition, secrecy, survival, the will to carve a place. These things were ugly only if one could afford to despise them. Harry had been too lonely for that. The pause lengthened. The hall beyond the hat must be holding its breath. Well then, the voice said at last, almost gently. Better be Slytherin. The hat was whipped off. Sound crashed over Harry in one enormous wave. For an instant, he did not move. The house table draped in green had already begun to clap, though the sound there was sharper, more astonished, less unanimous than at any of the other sortings. Draco Malfoy had half risen to his feet, staring openly. Across the hall, Ron looked as though someone had tipped a pail of cold water over him. Hermione, sitting stiff-backed among the Gryffindors, did not look frightened so much as furiously thoughtful. At the high table, McGonagall's mouth had thinned by a degree. The old headmaster only watched Harry with those glimmering eyes that seemed to take in far too much. Then Harry stood because not to stand would have been worse, and he walked to Slytherin because there was nowhere else to go. Draco made room immediately. So did a dark-haired girl with a pointed face and an expression that suggested she had hoped for a better seatmate, and meant to recover from the disappointment by observing him mercilessly. A narrow boy with long fingers and old solemn eyes inclined his head but did not smile. Crabbe and Goyle looked pleased with the general drama of things. Harry sat down among them and felt, with nauseating clarity, the whole school resorting itself around him. Dumbledore rose to give his welcome speech. It should have been absurd. There were rules against entering the Forbidden Forest, threats about the third-floor corridor, a brief announcement that was mostly nonsense and ended with nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. Yet Harry heard almost none of it. The Slytherin table had bent inward, voices dropping beneath the renewed clatter of plates. Someone further down was saying, "Potter," with incredulous delight. Someone else, older, laughed softly and said, "Well, that will make things interesting." Food appeared all at once in silver dishes. Harry, who had spent the boat ride sick with nerves, discovered he was ravenous. He reached automatically for potatoes, bread, roast chicken. Beside him, Draco was speaking without quite seeming to speak, keeping his face toward the platters, while his voice slipped from one topic to another, with the ease of someone raised among overheard strategy. "My father said you'd be watched closely," he said. "Not that you'd be here. Nobody thought that. You should have seen Weasley's face." "Mehdi." Harry took a piece of bread and said nothing. Draco leaned back, the candlelight making gold of his lashes. "Still," he went on, "it's not a bad place to surprise people. Better than Hufflepuff, or Gryffindor if you like noise more than thought. You'll find Slytherin takes care of its own." There was an emphasis on the last word that might have been a promise. Harry felt the table's regard like a touch between the shoulder blades. To his right, the dark-haired girl said, "Pansy Parkinson," as though granting him permission to know it. The solemn boy added, after a delay that made the gesture feel deliberate, "Theodore Knott." Harry repeated the names. He noticed that nobody asked whether he was pleased. In Gryffindor, across the hall, Ron was being clapped on the back by his brothers, still throwing bewildered glances in Harry's direction. Hermione was already listening to an older girl explain something with grave intensity. The distance between the tables seemed far greater than the width of the hall. Pansy, helping herself to gravy, said with casual malice, "Imagine Petunia Dursley's face if she knew." Harry's head came up. "How do you know my aunt's name?" Pansy looked startled into honesty. "Everybody's read about you." "Not that part." Draco smiled faintly. "Some people pay attention to details." Harry set down his fork. "My aunt and uncle are muggles." He had not meant to say it aloud. The words simply arrived, bright and hard, because he found suddenly that he did not want these people to think he had come from some gleaming old house like theirs. Let them know the cupboard. Let them know the city estate in Surrey where magic was spoken of like a stain. Let them know he had nothing but the name. There was a minute shift in the air. Pansy's brows rose. Crabbe stopped chewing. Theodore not only watched with that deep-set stillness of his. Draco's expression altered less than the others, but Harry saw the tiny pause before he replied. "So?" Draco said at last. It should have sounded dismissive. Instead, it sounded like a question he had not known he was asking. "So," Harry said, hearing the heat in his own voice, "if anyone's going to talk rubbish about muggles, maybe don't do it as though you expect me to clap." A silence opened around them. Not broad enough for the whole table to notice, but large enough to make Harry certain he had just stepped onto a path without seeing where it led. Then Theodore let out a soft breath that might have been the ghost of a laugh, and Draco, after a moment, smiled, not kindly, but with a new edge of interest. "Well," he said, "there's our first rule then. Don't assume what Potter will clap for." "No idea." When the feast ended, prefects led the first years through a succession of corridors and descending staircases into the lower reaches of the castle, where the air grew cooler and the stone older and damp with the memory of earth. The Slytherin common room lay behind a stretch of blank dungeon wall that opened only after the password was spoken. Inside, green lamps burned low over carved chairs and dark wood tables. The ceiling was low compared with the hall above, but richly vaulted. Silver serpents wound through the stone. Along one wall, long panes of thick glass looked out into dark water, where weed drifted like hair, and once, as Harry stood there trying not to stare like a tourist, some enormous shadow moved beyond the wavering green and vanished. "Under the lake," Draco said beside him, not without pride. "Best room in the castle." Harry thought of the boats skimming black water under the moon, of being sorted before the whole school into the house everyone had told him to fear, of Ron's stunned face, and the hat's voice naming hurts he had not wanted named. Then he looked at the slow green light across the floor, the silver scales inlaid on the hearth, the cluster of students already settling in as if they had been born for it, and felt something he could not yet call comfort but might one day mistake for it. Best room in the castle, perhaps. Or the first room that had ever wanted him badly enough to close the door. The first thing Harry learned about Slytherin House was that nothing there happened plainly. In Gryffindor, as far as he could tell from watching the scarlet-clad crowds at breakfast, people quarreled by raising their voices and became friends by dropping into one another's seats. Slytherin conducted most of its business with the slightest movements of mouth and eye, as though the house had been built not merely in the dungeons, but inside a long whisper. Older students nodded to Harry in corridors with an attention that never felt simple. One sixth year with a severe plat and a prefect's badge paused outside the common room to tell him, in a voice smooth as folded silk, that fey might be a kind of currency, but it was unstable unless invested wisely. Then she moved on before he could ask what exactly she expected him to invest in. Pansy Parkinson laughed when he told Draco about it. Theodore Knott, who spent much of his time looking as though he were listening to thoughts no one else could hear, said, "Gemma says things like that when she's decided whether or not a person is worth cultivating." Harry supposed he ought to have been flattered. He mostly felt as though people were measuring him for something invisible. The dormitory he shared with Draco, Crabbe, Goyle, Theodore, and a handsome, dark-eyed boy named Blaise Zabini was hung in green and silver and lit at night by lamps dim enough to make the bed hangings look like strips of water. Through the thick lake-facing windows, the world outside shifted with slow aquatic life. Once Harry woke in the dark and saw, beyond the glass, a pale cluster of fish turn all at once and flash like a scatter of coins. Another night, an arm of weed knocked soundlessly against the pane and drifted away. The dungeon air smelled of stone, smoke, and the faint mineral cold of deep water. It should have been gloomy. Instead, it felt secretive, like being inside a thought one was not ready to speak aloud. Yet, secrecy, Harry found almost at once, was not the same as ease. Slytherin boys dressed in the morning with a practiced neatness that made his own fumbling seem crude. Draco tied his school tie as though he had been born with that exact strip of cloth in his hands. Blaise polished the silver clasp of his cloak without hurry. Crabbe and Goyle, though lacking their doormat's elegance, were at least possessed of the brutish confidence of those who had never been told they were in the way. Harry, by contrast, still half expected to be shouted at for touching the wrong wash basin or taking up too much space. He discovered very quickly that people noticed fear in Slytherin, and if they found it interesting, they might lean close to see whether it would harden or crack. Classes began in earnest. Charms with Professor Flitwick, who had to stand on a pile of books to see over his desk and spoke of wand movement, as though discussing music. History of magic with Professor Binns, a ghost so monotonous that even the dead seemed capable of boredom. Transfiguration with McGonagall, who could slice a room into silence by setting her spectacles a fraction lower on her nose. Harry saw Ron often enough in doorways and corridors and lineups, but each sighting held the faint awkwardness of having quarreled with someone without ever quite reaching the argument. Ron was not unkind when their eyes met. That was almost worse. He looked puzzled and a little wounded, as though Harry had promised him something on the train and then broken it by sitting at the wrong table. Hermione Granger, on the other hand, did not bother with awkwardness. She looked at Harry as if she meant to solve him. Twice in the library, he found her already established in the corner he wanted, books spread around her in defensive walls. Once she moved a pile without being asked, which might have been a peace offering if she had not then informed him he was holding magical theory upside down. He told her he had only been skimming. She said, in a tone suggesting skimming was an unfortunate habit of the underprepared, "That would at least explain your notes." He found, to his annoyance, that he rather liked her. The class everyone spoke of in lowered voices was potions. They had it on Thursday morning in one of the lower dungeon classrooms, colder even than the Slytherin common room, with pickled things floating in jars along the walls, and the smell of herbs, metal and vinegar lying over everything like a permanent threat. Harry entered with his stomach tight. Snape, head of Slytherin, had watched the sorting with a face unreadable as shut ink, but Harry had felt that gaze often since, across the hall, along corridors, through the brief disorder of changing classrooms. It was not the simple disapproval Snape directed at Neville Longbottom when cauldrons looked likely to melt, nor the slyly indulgent amusement he extended to Draco's better answers. It was sharper than either, and infinitely more personal. Snape began the lesson in a voice barely above a murmur, which somehow forced every child in the room to lean toward him. He spoke of bottled fame and brewed glory, of stoppering death, of the exactness demanded by potion work. It was not a speech to harden 11-year-olds. It was a warning dressed as temptation. Harry, who had spent years learning the moods of adults before they announced them, felt at once that Snape enjoyed the effect, and despised needing it. Then Snape's black eyes slid to Harry. "Potter," he said, "what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Every other head turned. Harry knew with a cold sinking sensation that this was the moment everyone had expected, the famous boy to be measured and perhaps found wanting. He did not know the answer. He opened his mouth, closed it, and heard Hermione's hand shoot into the air in the silence. "I don't know, sir." Snape ignored Hermione. "Let us try again. Where, Potter, would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar?" Harry wished, with sudden violence, that he had never been born famous enough for adults to make a sport of him. "I don't know, sir." "And what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" Hermione's hand waved furiously now. A few Slytherins smiled into their cauldrons. Draco's smile was smaller, almost troubled. Harry looked straight at Snape. "I don't know," he said. And because something proud in him refused to grovel, he added, "But I think Hermione does." "Why don't you ask her?" The classroom stilled so completely that the simmering cauldrons seemed loud. Snape's upper lip thinned. "Sit down, Miss Granger, before you dislocate your shoulder. Clearly fame is not a substitute for study." A small hot pulse of humiliation went through Harry. He stared at his worktable and missed Snape's next instruction entirely. Yet what happened afterward puzzled him more than the public embarrassment. When they began brewing a simple cure for boils, Harry found himself slicing dried nettles a little too thick from nerves. Snape swept past, cape stirring cold air, and said in the same contemptuous tone he might have used to announce rain, "If you cut like that, Potter, you may as well feed the potion to a pig." Then, almost without moving his lips, he added, "Finer, and crush the snake fangs before the horned slugs, not after." Harry obeyed before he could think. The potion in his cauldron cleared from muddy brown to an acceptable deep rose. Snape did not praise him. He did not even glance back. But he took 5 points from a Gryffindor boy whose potion was smoking and passed Harry's table without comment. Outside the classroom, Draco caught up with him before the others. "You should have known those answers," he said, sounding annoyed on Harry's behalf rather than superior. "Everyone learns basic ingredients if their family's sensible." "My family wasn't sensible," Harry said shortly. Draco hesitated. "Right. Dot." Ahead of them, Hermione was marching with furious purpose, her books clamped to her chest. Pansy, falling in with them from another corridor, let out a derisive little laugh. "Granger's insufferable. She acts as if she owns the classroom. No wonder. Mud." "Don't," Harry said. The word stopped Pansy so abruptly she nearly missed a step. Draco looked at him. Harry himself was startled by the force in his own voice. "I don't want to hear it," he said. Pansy recovered first. "Why ever not?" Because Hermione's face had gone still when Snape refused to call on her. Because Harry knew what it was to be told. You did not count until your usefulness was required. Because if he let that word into the air beside him, it would settle somewhere he did not want to live. He shrugged as if it were nothing. "She's annoying enough without inventing extra reasons." Pansy sniffed. Draco said nothing. They reached the next turning in silence. Then a voice behind Harry drawled, "Potter, a moment." Snape stood in the shadow of an arch, hands folded into his sleeves. Pansy vanished instantly. Draco lingered just long enough to look curious before deciding headmasters of houses were one form of danger even he respected. Harry approached with his shoulders already braced. "Yes, sir?" Snape regarded him with an expression so cool it felt almost surgical. "If you insist upon making little speeches," he said, "choose your audience more carefully. Slytherin has a long memory for public contradictions." Harry flushed. "I wasn't making a speech." "No." Snape's gaze flicked once toward the corridor where Pansy had gone. "Then your instincts are reckless in addition to undereducated." Something in Harry scraped raw from years of being blamed for things he did not understand, answered before caution could catch it. "Would you rather I'd said nothing?" For 1 suspended second, Snape simply looked at him. Then, to Harry's astonishment, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, precisely, but the shape a smile might leave behind if it passed too quickly to see. "I would rather," Snape said softly, "that if you must defy the habits of your house, you learn to profit from it." He turned and swept away, black robes cutting through the torchlight. Harry stood where he was, more unsettled than if he had been shouted at. Profit from it. Not stop. Not apologize. Not fall into line. Profit. That night, lying in the dim green wash from the lake windows while the other boys settled with varying degrees of noise, Harry listened to the slow press of water beyond the glass and thought about the hat's voice in his head, about Snape's barely concealed warning, about Draco's baffled interest and Hermione's intolerable raised hand and Ron's puzzled glances across classroom. Slytherin, he was beginning to understand, was not a nest of villains. It was a place where everyone had already decided that every gesture must earn its keep. He did not yet know whether he could live that way. He knew only that, without meaning to, he had already begun. The first morning they were scheduled for flying dawned with the kind of sharp blue sky that made the battlements seem cut from ice. By then Harry had been at Hogwarts long enough to know which staircases tended toward mischief, which portraits gave useful directions if flattered correctly, and which older Slytherins he could safely ignore without causing offense. He had also learned that not all prejudice announced itself with Pansy Parkinson's cheerfully vicious openness. Some of it wore the face of assumption. Gryffindors assumed he regretted his house. Ravenclaws assumed his fame had been an administrative inconvenience to everybody. Hufflepuffs mostly waited to see what he would do. Slytherins, for their part, seemed divided between those who wished to claim him and those who expected him to fail in some instructive way. Flying lesson gave them all a spectacle. The first years lined up beside a row of school brooms on the grass, Slytherin and Gryffindor together, which meant Harry felt Ron's presence almost as strongly as the wind. Madame Hooke had yellow eyes like a hawk and a whistle that could have sent armies into retreat. She barked instructions. Brooms leapt more obediently to some hands than others. Neville Longbottom shot up at once and nearly took his face off. Hermione's rolled over as though offended by her tone. Harry slapped neatly into his palm the first time, so quick it felt almost like recognition. Then Neville mounted too soon, kicked too hard, and shot upward like a dropped firework. He rose, wobbled, squealed, and came down in a tangle of limbs that made the entire line gasp. Madame Hooch sprinted to him. The rest were left clutching brooms and staring. Neville's wrist was broken. His round face shone white with pain. In the grass beside him, overlooked by everyone for a moment except Draco, lay a glass ball which had fallen from his pocket. "I remember all," Draco said, stooping. He turned it in the sunlight, the smoke inside whirling red as blood. "Longbottom, you really should remember not to fall off things." There was laughter from several students. Neville looked miserable. Madame Hooke, occupied with bandaging his wrist and threatening the entire class with expulsion if anyone mounted a broom while she was gone, did not hear. She hurried Neville toward the castle, her cloak snapping behind her. The moment she disappeared over the rise, Draco rose smoothly onto his broom. "What are you doing?" Hermione cried. Draco did not answer her. He hovered a few feet above them, Remembrall glittering between his fingers, and aimed his voice precisely at Neville's retreating back. "Maybe I'll leave this in a tree for him, if he can find it." Ron swore. Harry felt something hot and immediate go through him. Not quite anger, not quite the desire to defend Neville, whom he barely knew, but a fierce refusal to stand rooted while Draco made the sky itself into his audience. Before he had time to consider that Madame Hooch had expressly forbidden it, he swung onto his broom and kicked off the ground. Gasps rose below. Cold air hit his face. The earth dropped away. If the castle had offered wonder and the Slytherin dungeon had offered secrecy, the broom offered a third thing Harry had not known he was missing: relief. Everything that had been dense and uncertain below him thinned at once. The lines of the grounds opened. The wind came hard and clean over the pitch. His body knew, before his thoughts did how to lean, correct, climb. He did not feel brave. He felt answered. Draco, a little higher in the head, twisted round in astonishment. Then his mouth split into a grin. "About time," he called, and flung the remembrall upward. It flashed, a brief red star against the blue. Harry rose after it. Later, he would remember certain details with impossible clarity. The broom vibrating beneath his hands like a living thing. The bite of cold in his eyes. The shouts from below diminishing into nonsense. Draco banking aside at the last instant, the glass ball beginning its fall. He leaned forward, dropped, and the world rushed upward to meet him. For one terrible half-second he had no plan except to be faster than gravity. Then his broom answered his weight. He flattened against the handle, thrust out one arm, and caught the remembrall inches before it struck the ground. Momentum carried him past the watching class in a streak. He hauled the broom up, almost overshot, steadied, and came down hard enough to jar his teeth. Silence met him, then a few scattered cries all at once. Madame Hooch's voice did not join them. Instead another did, lower and carrying farther for that very reason. Interesting. Marcus Flint stood at the edge of the grounds with two older Slytherins and an expression of calculating delight. Broad-shouldered and heavy-jawed, he had the air of someone who thought most problems could be solved by knocking through them. Yet Harry saw instantly that there was intelligence under the brute's solidity. Beside Flint stood a taller boy Harry recognized by sight as Terence Higgs, Slytherin's current seeker, whose face had gone dark and flat. "What in Merlin's name do you think you're doing?" Madame Hooch came striding back. Neville forgotten long enough to be replaced by pure fury. "I said no one was to fly." She might have been more terrifying if Harry had not still been half drunk on speed. He handed her the remembrall without argument. Before she could continue, Flint stepped forward. "With respect, Madame Hooch," he said, "I'd like permission for Potter to attend Slytherin trials." Madame Hooch rounded on him. "He is a first year." "So was half the Black family before they learned any better," Flint said. "And Higgs can do with the competition." Higgs made a strangled sound of offense. Flint ignored him. Across the line of Gryffindors, Ron stared at Harry as though he had turned into something else midair. Hermione looked furious and impressed at once. Draco, who had landed with considerably less flair than Harry and was now smoothing his hair with the air of someone concealing both embarrassment and admiration, said under his breath, "You mad." By lunch, the entire school knew. McGonagall did not recruit Harry for Gryffindor because Harry was not hers to recruit. Instead, Snape found him after the meal with the speed of news carried along hidden routes. He said very little. He only looked Harry up and down as though assessing a weapon whose edge he had not expected to find in his own cupboard. "Flint wishes to place you on the team," Snape said. "I have informed him that if your schoolwork suffers, I will hold him personally responsible for it." Harry, who had been prepared for a reprimand and had not known what to do with it if it came, blinked. "You're letting me play?" Snape's brows moved minutely. "Do not confuse tolerance for enthusiasm, Potter." But his eyes, dark and unreadable, rested for a moment on Harry's face and then flicked away. Trials at 4. Slytherin practice revealed immediately that school fame meant very little to older students who cared only for winning. Terence Higgs flew like an offended falcon and made no attempt to hide his resentment. Flint barked orders without apology. The chasers treated Harry like an inconvenient new variable. Yet once the balls were in the air and the pitch opened around him, Harry stopped caring what any of them thought. He chased sunlight off the metal hoops. He cut through crosswinds. He saw how the game stretched into patterns above the field. Feints, swerves, blocked lines, false openings, sudden dives. The snitch itself did not appear during practice, but by the time they landed, Flint had seen enough. "Higgs, bench," he said. "Potter, you're in." Higgs swore. Flint ignored that too. The match against Gryffindor came in November beneath a sky bruised with cloud. Rain began as a fine mist and thickened until the players were slick with it. Wood, Gryffindor's captain, looked personally insulted by the arrangement of the world. Ron sat in the stands among the scarlet scarves, divided so visibly between loyalty and awe that even Fred and George were laughing at him. Hermione sat on the other side with her hands clenched around the rail and her mouth pinched, as if all sport were a barbaric interruption to more serious pursuits. Harry scarcely noticed them once the whistle blew. The first minutes were chaos. Bludgers screamed past. Rain needled his eyes. The crowd rose and fell below in colored blurs. He lost sight of the snitch 3 times and each time found himself instead tracking some minute vibration in the air, some flicker of gold almost there, then gone. Slytherin took an early lead. Gryffindor answered. Flint nearly knocked a chaser off her broom and claimed innocence with such robust dishonesty that even the Slytherin stands laughed. High above the pitch, Harry saw, very briefly, Snape at the edge of the crowd. Black robes whipping, his gaze fixed not on the game but on Harry. Quirrell, turbaned and twitchy, stood a little way off, lips moving. Then Harry's broom lurched. It was not the ordinary jolt of bad weather. It was a savage, unnatural buck, as though the handle were trying to throw him. His stomach shot into his throat. He clung with both knees and barely kept from sliding off. The broom jerked again, worse. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Somewhere far below people were pointing. Harry looked down and caught a glimpse of Hermione shoving through a row, Ron at her heels, both of them staring towards Snape with murderous suspicion. The broom pitched sideways. Harry's hands burned from gripping. Wind roared in his ears. He had one absurd instant to think, I'm going to fall in front of everyone, before a glint at the edge of vision cut through panic. Gold. Near one of the Gryffindor goal hoops, hovering as placidly as if the air around it were not trying to murder him. Harry moved before fear could object. He let go with one hand. The broom dived in furious jerks. He flattened himself, teeth clenched, and went after the snitch with the reckless concentration of someone who understands that one target is easier to meet than 10. The stands vanished. The storm vanished. There was only the wild lurching handle, the bite of rain, the flash of gold. He opened his mouth because his fingers were not going to reach in time. The snitch flew straight into it. He hit the ground on one knee, coughing and half laughing, and spat the tiny golden ball into his palm. For a suspended second, nobody reacted. Then the pitch exploded. Slytherin won. Green scarves whirled. Flint bellowed with triumph. Several older students pounded Harry on the back hard enough to bruise. Draco, white with excitement, shouted himself hoarse. Somewhere behind all of it, Hermione emerged from the stands with singed skirts and an expression of grim vindication, while Snape brushed at one smoking hem of his robes, as though a tiny fire at his feet were a commonplace nuisance. Ron climbed down last, looking as if he had not yet decided whether to shake Harry's hand or throttle him for making Slytherin victory feel exhilarating. That night, the common room received Harry like a conquering prince and a dangerous rumor at once. Toasts were made in pumpkin juice and illicitly acquired butterbeer. Flint declared that perhaps first years were not entirely useless. Pansy announced that Gryffindor had looked sick, which improved the whole occasion. Terence Higgs did not appear. Harry laughed when people expected him to laugh. He accepted praise because refusing it would have been its own sort of performance. Yet late, when the green lamps had burned low and the lake windows showed only his own dim reflection, he remembered the moment before the snitch, when the broom had tried to kill him, and he had seen Snape staring and Quirrell muttering. Something had happened in the storm besides winning. He had not yet the shape of it. He knew only that the sky, once entered, had no intention of letting him remain ordinary. The days after the match changed less than Harry would once have expected and more than he liked. His name, already in everyone's mouth for reasons that had nothing to do with him, acquired new uses. Older Slytherins nodded to him as if success in the air had translated into an understood position on the ground. Students from other houses watched him with fresh curiosity. Gryffindors, especially, seemed to have developed a theory that being sorted into Slytherin had turned every achievement of his into a form of theft. Harry had beaten them fair and square, but fairness looked suspicious when dressed in green. If he laughed too readily at Flint's crude jokes, he was proving what Slytherins were like. If he sat with his head bent over homework in the library, he was clearly plotting something. Fame, he discovered, did not become easier simply because people attached different reasons to it. The only people who did not quite know what to make of him were Ron and Hermione, which made them the easiest company by far. He began running into them in places where collisions could not be accidental. Ron, on his way back from chess club or devouring toast in the entrance hall. Hermione in the library, where she had an uncanny instinct for finding the exact shelf Harry needed and informing him he was handling the books incorrectly. Their conversations were prickly, interrupted, and more real than anything Harry managed in the Slytherin common room. Ron wanted to ask about flying, but did not want to sound impressed. Hermione wanted to know whether Slytherin students actually believed half the nonsense they repeated about old families and proper breeding. Harry wanted, though he would have choked rather than admit it, to be with people who did not weigh every sentence for tactical advantage. Draco noticed. Of course, Draco noticed. On the afternoon of their first charms, lesson on levitation, when Flitwick had them swishing and flicking feathers all over the room, Hermione's feather shot up at once and hovered so beautifully that even Flitwick squeaked. Ron's refused to do more than drag itself across the desk like something suffering a mortal disappointment. Harry's wobbled, rose an inch, and fell. Draco's went up neatly enough, though he spent more time watching Harry than his own wand work. After class, Hermione corrected Ron's wand movement in the corridor with the fatal earnestness of a girl who believed accuracy excused timing. Ron, stung by embarrassment and the fresh memory of his own feather's stubbornness, muttered far more loudly than he intended. No wonder she hasn't got any friends. Harry heard it. So did Hermione. She did not look at either of them. She only tightened her grip on her books and walked away with her back very straight. Harry had a sudden vision of the cupboard under the stairs, of years of learning not to react when people wanted him to. He nearly called after her. Then he saw Pansy approaching from the opposite end with two other Slytherin girls, watched Draco's expectant half-smile, and the moment slid by because Harry let it. That evening, Halloween transformed the Great Hall. Hundreds of pumpkins hovered under the enchanted ceiling, each carved with a different expression, some laughing and some grimacing and some so elaborately done. They looked like lantern-faced kings suspended over the feast. The smell of roasted meat and spices filled the room. Ghosts drifted through candle smoke. Harry sat at the Slytherin table beside Draco and found himself looking more often than he meant to toward the gap where Hermione was not sitting among the Gryffindors. She ought to have been there. She never missed a meal. When Quirrell burst in, turban askew and eyes bulging, most people thought at first that the entrance itself must be part of the entertainment. Then he gasped, "Troll, in the dungeons. Thought you ought to know," and collapsed in a heap. The hall erupted. Benches scraped. Students shouted. Professors rose. Dumbledore's voice rolled out over the confusion, magically amplified into command. Prefects were to lead their houses back to the dormitories at once. Teachers would deal with the troll. Slytherins were ordered toward the dungeon stair. Harry took 2 steps with them and stopped. The troll was in the dungeons. Hermione was missing. He did not think. Thinking was slower, and would have left room for all the excellent reasons to stay in line. He shoved back against the tide of black robes and started across the hall. Draco caught his sleeve. "Where are you going?" "Hermione's not here." "So, tell a prefect." "There isn't time." Draco's fingers tightened. Not enough to truly stop him, but enough to show that he meant it. Potter torted. Harry looked at him. For a second, something passed between them harder to name than friendship, and closer to it than anything they had yet managed. Draco understood the risk. He understood, too, perhaps, that Harry had already chosen. Harry pulled free. Ron intercepted him in the entrance corridor, red hair bright under torchlight. "You thought of it, too." The relief in Harry's chest was ridiculous. "Come on." They ran through echoing passages while the castle above them shook with distant confusion. Twice they nearly collided with fleeing students. Once Peeves swooped down, shrieking merrily about blood and broken bones until Harry threatened to tell the bloody Baron where Peeves had hidden firecrackers last week. The poltergeist vanished in outrage. Hermione's bathroom door stood ajar when they reached it. From inside came a crash so violent it shook dust from the ceiling. Harry shoved the door open. The mountain troll filled the room like some grotesque mistake. It had already smashed 2 sinks from the wall and torn the doors off the nearest stalls. Water flooded the floor, reflecting torchlight in wild amber shards. Hermione stood trapped at the far end between a shattered cubicle and the wall. White-faced, her wand uselessly clutched in one hand. The troll swung its club with no more awareness than weather, yet each blow turned stone into ruin. The stench of it hit them a heartbeat later. Sweat, rot, and old earth. Harry moved first because terror made stillness impossible. "Oi!" he shouted, and snatched up a broken length of pipe from the floor. He hurled it at the troll's head. It bounced off one huge shoulder. The creature turned slowly, stupidly, and blinked at him. Ron made a noise that was half groan, half commitment. The troll charged. Everything after that happened too quickly for order. Harry slid in the water and nearly went down under the first swing. Ron grabbed his robe and yanked him sideways, saving him from a club that smashed tiles where his legs had been. Hermione screamed something about the sink chain. Harry saw, absurdly clearly, the iron pull hanging from the wall by the pipes. He darted toward it. The troll swung again. Ron shouted a levitation charm that came out mangled with panic. Nothing happened. Harry seized the chain and dragged with all his strength. Every remaining tap in the room burst open at once. A jet of freezing water hit the troll full in the face. The creature bellowed and lurched, foot skidding on the flooded floor. Hermione, recovering the use of her voice if not her composure, scrambled sideways and shouted, "It's club!" Ron's next spell landed. The troll's club tore out of its hand, rose wobbling through the air, and then, with the blunt inevitability of a dropped cathedral stone, came down on its owner's skull. The troll swayed. For one impossible second it seemed to consider its options. Then it crashed forward into the wreckage of the sinks with a force that made the floor jump. Silence rang in the room, broken only by water hissing over broken pipes. Ron sat down abruptly where he was. Harry leaned against the wall, breathing as if he had swallowed fire. Hermione looked from one of them to the other, and then, very unexpectedly, began to laugh in a thin, shocked sort of way that was perilously close to crying. The voices arrived a moment later. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. Professor McGonagall burst in with Snape behind her and Quirrell last of all, one hand over his mouth as if he might be sick again. Snape took in the scene with one sweep of his eyes. Destroyed bathroom, unconscious troll, 3 drenched first years. "Idiots," McGonagall said, but it came out more shaken than furious. Quirrell made a tiny moaning sound at the sight of the troll and sank against the wall. Snape's gaze landed on Harry's bleeding knuckles, then on Ron's soaked robes, then on Hermione. It was Hermione who saved them. "I went looking for it," she said, still breathless. "I thought I could handle it because I'd read about trolls, but I was wrong. Harry and Ron came to find me. If they hadn't, I'd be dead now." Harry stared. It was a lie, and a brave one. Ron stared too, equally astonished. McGonagall's face changed by increments. "Miss Granger, this was an extremely foolish thing to do." "Yes, Professor. For sheer dumb luck and courage, I cannot deny that Mr. Potter and Mr. Weasley deserve credit." She drew herself up. 5 points each to Slytherin and Gryffindor. "Miss Granger, I am disappointed in you." 5 points from Gryffindor. Quirrell gave the troll one appalled glance and fled. McGonagall sent them all away before she could think better of her leniency. Snape remained in the doorway as Harry passed him. "Potter," he said quietly. Harry stopped. Snape's eyes moved once over the wrecked room. "If you are going to ignore direct instructions, try next time to do it somewhere less expensive." It was so dry, so nearly a joke and yet not one, that Harry looked up despite himself. Snape had already turned away. In the corridor outside, Hermione wrapped her arms around herself and shivered. Ron rubbed water from his face and said gruffly, "That was mental." "You told me," Hermione said with a sudden return of her ordinary sharpness, "that spells work better if one pronounces them properly." "You're welcome," said Ron. Harry laughed then because he could not help it. They all did, helplessly and a little wildly, there in the torchlit corridor with troll water drying on their robes and the castle settling around them after terror. It was not elegance. It was not strategy. It was not the kind of alliance Slytherin prized. It was better. It was the strange, lopsided beginning of trust. When Harry returned to the dungeon later, Draco was waiting by the common room fire with an expression so controlled, it became obvious at once how angry he was. "You vanished," he said. "There was a troll. In the dungeons. Precisely where we were told to go." "And..." Harry pulled off his wet robe and met Draco's gaze. Hermione was there. Draco's jaw shifted. "So this is what happens now? Gryffindors drop a handkerchief and you run after them?" It was unfair, and Harry heard the fear under it more clearly than the insult. That made answering more difficult. "She'd have died." Draco looked at him for a long moment, then away. The fire painted gold along one side of his face and left the other in shadow. "You could have died too," he said, much quieter. Harry had no answer ready for that. In Privet Drive, his own safety had never been a subject anyone raised unless he was being blamed for lacking it. To hear it from Draco, edged and awkward and real, unsettled him more than the argument itself. That night, with the troll already becoming legend in the castle's swift rumor, Harry lay awake in the green dark and felt the shape of the school altering again. Somewhere overhead, Hermione Granger slept in Gryffindor Tower. Somewhere in another dormitory, Ron Weasley was probably replaying the levitation charm with all the additions he wished he had made to sound cleverer. Beside Harry, Draco turned once sharply in sleep and then stilled. The house tables remained where they had always been. The banners had not moved. Yet the lines between them no longer seemed as fixed as the sorting had made them feel. Perhaps that was the real danger of Hogwarts. Not that it told children what they were. That, despite every table in the hall, it kept offering them chances to become something else. After the troll, friendship did not arrive all at once like a banner unfurled. It came in bits that might have looked inconsequential from a distance. A place made at the library table without comment, Ron saving Harry a seat in the courtyard after herbology, Hermione pausing over a difficult transfiguration essay and saying, without even pretending reluctance, "Show me what you've done, and I'll explain where you went wrong." Harry had never had friends before. The thing itself felt unstable, too pleasant to trust, and all the more so because it crossed the boundaries everyone around them still assumed should matter. He ate at Slytherin, slept in Slytherin, played Quidditch for Slytherin, and collected enough sly looks from older students to know some of them considered his wandering loyalties either useful or suspect. Yet the hours he spent with Ron and Hermione were the only ones in which he did not feel watched for what might be gained. It was Hermione who first insisted Snape was after whatever the three-headed dog was guarding. Harry and Ron had told her at last about the forbidden corridor and the beast beyond the trapdoor. They had discovered it a week after the Quidditch match while trying to avoid Filch during a nighttime investigation of Snape's suspicious behavior. Harry still had no idea whether he truly believed Snape had bewitched his broom. But he knew he had seen Snape muttering, had seen Quirrell nearby, had seen the odd hidden urgency between them. Under the invisibility cloak Harry received for Christmas, an anonymous gift that arrived with a note so brief it might as well have been a secret itself, he had taken to roaming the castle at night in search of answers and finding, more often, stranger questions. The discovery of Fluffy had made those questions sharper. Hagrid, cornered over tea and rock cakes, let slip the name Nicholas Flamel with all the studied casualness of someone who had no experience whatsoever of studied casualness. Hermione set upon the library like a commander storming an inadequately defended city. She scoured indexes, lists of famous alchemists, Old Daily Prophet references, genealogies, footnotes. Ron provided bursts of inspired memory from chocolate frog cards. Harry contributed the cloak, curiosity, and a growing impatience with the time ordinary research required. Draco, noticing Harry's absences and his sudden tendency to vanish from the common room after curfew, confronted him one evening beside the lake windows. "You're up to something," he said. Harry, more tired than careful, said, "Aren't you always telling me that if I'm going to break rules, I ought at least to do it profitably?" Draco's eyes narrowed. "That sounds like Snape." Harry said nothing. Draco stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If this is about the thing in the corridor, and you've told Granger and Weasley before telling me, then I'm insulted. You're welcome to stop calling them idiots every time they enter the room. That would leave me with very little to say." But he sounded less cutting than usual. Harry looked at him in the watery green light. Since Halloween, Draco's possessiveness had altered into something more complicated. He still disliked sharing Harry's attention with Gryffindors. He still spoke as though loyalty ought to move along house lines like blood in a body. Yet he had also stopped, almost entirely, using the ugliest language he heard from other Slytherins. Harry did not flatter himself that this was victory. It was, perhaps, the beginning of a question in Draco's mind that might prove more dangerous than certainty. It might also prove more useful. At Christmas, the castle emptied by degrees. Snow fell thick over the grounds and transformed the battlements into something severe and beautiful, a fortress in a children's tale. Ron stayed because his parents had gone to visit Charlie in Romania, and there was no room or money for every child to be ferried home at once. Harry stayed because there was nowhere else to go. Draco left in a flurry of finer robes than he wore at school, and the faint scent of expensive winter soap, promising to return before term and making it sound less like travel than withdrawal to a private court. On Christmas morning, Harry woke to presents at the foot of his bed, and the incredulous knowledge that some of them were his. A knitted jumper from Mrs. Weasley in dark green, trimmed with a silver H that made him laugh aloud. Sweets from Hermione with a note reminding him not to leave sticky fingerprints on rare books. A tin of treacle fudge from Hagrid. And beneath them all, folded to almost nothing, a cloak finer than spider silk, silver under the lamplight, with a brief note attached. "Your father's. Your father's. Use it well." The cloak changed everything. Or perhaps it only made it easier to reach the corners of things Harry had already begun to suspect. That night he slipped through the castle invisible as breath, moving among moonlit corridors where suits of armor gleamed and portraits snored. He went first to the library, and then, emboldened, to the restricted section, where the books hissed and clanked their chains, and one opened beneath his hand to emit a shriek so terrible he fled in blind panic. He ran until his lungs ached, turned 3 corners, ducked into a room at random, and only then dared stop. It was a classroom, long disused. Dust lay silver on the desks. Moonlight flowed through high windows and pooled before a great gilt mirror propped against the wall. There was writing carved along its top, ornate and difficult to read. Harry, still breathing hard, pulled off the cloak. Then he looked into the glass and forgot why he had run. At first, he thought there must be a roomful of people behind him. The reflection was crowded. A woman with dark red hair and green eyes stood nearest, one hand lifted as though she wished to touch his cheek through the surface. Beside her, a tall man with untidy black hair and glasses smiled with an ache of pride so naked it made Harry's throat close. More faces clustered beyond them, kind, curious, familiar only because they were not strangers to the shape of his own face. The woman's eyes were his eyes. The man's grin was his grin, and both of them were looking at him as if he had been wanted all his life. Harry spun. The room behind him was empty. He turned back and they were still there. He did not know how long he stood before the mirror that first night. Long enough for the cold to seep through his socks. Long enough for pain to become a softness he could almost mistake for peace. When at last he crept back to bed, dawn was whitening the windows over the lake. He returned the next night, and the next. He did not tell Ron what he saw until Ron caught him slipping out and insisted on coming. The mirror showed Ron as head boy, Quidditch captain, taller and older and brilliant in ways only second sons could imagine. It did not show Harry's parents when Ron stood in front of it. And that, more than anything, convinced Harry the glass was not haunted but something stranger. He went again alone after that, needing the sight of Lily and James with a hunger so unlike ordinary wanting that it frightened him. On the third night, Dumbledore was waiting. Harry had not heard him enter. One moment he was gazing at his parents. The next he saw, in the mirror's far edge, the old headmaster seated on a desk behind him, hands folded over one knee, and eyes bright as candle flame. "So," Dumbledore said, "back again." Harry turned so fast the cloak slid from his shoulders. "I didn't see you, sir." "That," said Dumbledore, "is generally the point of an invisibility cloak. Admirably done." "Nay." There was humor in his voice, but no mockery. Harry looked at the mirror and then back at Dumbledore. "What is it?" "The mirror of Earist." Dumbledore's face grew gentler. "It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts." Harry looked again. Lily's smile did not waver. James stood with his hand on Harry's shoulder in the reflection as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Harry swallowed hard. "Then mine's not very difficult to guess." "No," said Dumbledore softly. "Yours is not." He rose and stood beside Harry, the mirror painting silver over the old lines of his face. "Men have wasted away before it," he said, "entranced by what they have seen. Tomorrow it will be moved to a new home, and I ask you not to go looking for it. It does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live." Harry nodded because he was too ashamed not to. Yet even then some stubborn part of him resisted the simplicity of the lesson. The mirror had shown him his parents, yes, but it had shown more than grief. In the angle of James' body turned toward him, in Lily's lifted hand, in the crowd of faces behind them who looked like kin and memory and inheritance, there was also belonging. The mirror had not merely shown him people he loved and had lost. It had shown him a world in which he had never once needed to ask permission to exist. When Draco returned after the holidays, the castle seemed to tighten around him. He came back better dressed than the snow and twice as cold, with new gloves, a sharper haircut, and a measured stillness that made Harry think of men at ministry receptions whose smiles never reached their eyes. The first night back in the common room, Draco asked too casually whether anything unusual had happened over the holidays. "What sort of unusual?" Harry said. "The sort that matters." Harry thought of the mirror and said, "I got a jumper from Mrs. Weasley." Draco looked at him for a long moment and then laughed in disbelief. "You're impossible." But something in his own laughter rang hollow. Over the following days, Harry noticed that Draco read letters from home twice before burning them. He had always spoken of his father with pride touched by imitation. Now occasionally there was strain beneath the pride, as if Lucius Malfoy's expectations had acquired a weight that sat oddly on 11-year-old shoulders. The answer to Nicholas Flamel came, absurdly, from a chocolate frog card Harry had nearly thrown aside months earlier. Dumbledore's card mentioned his work with the alchemist. Hermione pounced on the connection, disappeared into a stack of heavy library volumes, and resurfaced triumphantly with the whole story. Flamel, creator of the Philosopher's Stone, capable of turning metal to gold and producing the elixir of life. Harry sat very still while she explained, because all at once the dog, the trapdoor, Snape's muttering, Hagrid's anxious evasions, and Dumbledore's partnership with an immortal alchemist snapped together. The stone was hidden at Hogwarts, and someone wanted it. Harry should have felt reassured that the mystery now had a name. Instead, the knowledge sharpened his unease. Whatever lay under that trapdoor was not merely precious. It was old, powerful, and exactly the sort of thing people killed for in the stories wizards told with lowered voices. That night, returning alone toward the dungeons after leaving Ron and Hermione in a debate about whether Dumbledore knew, Harry found Draco waiting in the shadow of an arch, one hand in his pocket and a letter seal ground beneath his heel. "Well?" Draco asked. Harry stopped. "Well, what?" "You've got the look of someone who solved a riddle and discovered he preferred it unsolved." Harry hesitated. Then, because the castle had already made honest people of stranger combinations than this, he said, "It's the Philosopher's Stone." Draco went quite still. "Are you certain?" "Hermione is." "That wasn't what I asked." Harry looked at him. Draco's face had gone white under the torchlight, the pupils of his eyes large and dark. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Harry thought of the burnt letters, the careful questions, the new hardness around Draco's mouth. "Why?" Harry said slowly. "What have you heard?" Draco's expression shut at once, but not quickly enough. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause he seemed to drag into existence. "Only that there are certain artifacts important enough that grown men talk nonsense when they want to mention them in front of children." Harry did not answer. The silence between them filled with everything Draco had not said. Fathers at polished tables, ministry names, old families who collected stories of powerful things the way other people collected silver. For the first time, Harry wondered whether Draco's interest in the stone had begun not with schoolboy curiosity, but with inheritance. "If your father knows about it," Harry said, "then other people probably do too." Draco gave a brief, bitter smile. "That would be my father exactly, certain no one else is clever enough to overhear him." They stood there a moment longer, two boys from opposite ends of the world, linked by a secret under the school and by adults whose motives neither of them trusted. Then Draco said, very quietly, "Be careful, Harry." It was the first time he had said Harry's name like a warning rather than an argument. If winter at Hogwarts made secrets gleam, spring made them rot. By March the castle smelled of damp stone and soil waking under frost, and everything Harry had managed to keep in separate compartments began to spill into everything else. There was Quidditch, with Flint's increasingly brutal practices, and the delight Slytherin took in winning. There was schoolwork, which Hermione insisted was not optional simply because someone might be trying to steal an immortal alchemist's treasure. There was Draco, who had become both more careful and more volatile, now quick to sneer one moment and unexpectedly silent the next. And there was Hagrid, whose capacity for holding dangerous secrets proved as poor as his capacity for collecting dangerous creatures was enthusiastic. The dragon began in smoke. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went down to Hagrid's hut one rainy evening because they had not seen him at dinner, and because Hagrid, when he missed meals, was either heartsick or hatching something. They found him crouched by the fire with his beard tied back by necessity, and a black egg the size of a football resting in the flames. A smell like singed iron filled the hut. Hagrid was smiling with the beatific terror of a man watching his fondest wish become an obvious catastrophe. "Won it," he said before any of them could ask. "Down in the village. Had a bit of a game with a stranger. Reckon he was glad to get rid of it now I think on it." "Hagrid," Hermione said faintly. "That's illegal." Hagrid looked offended by the idea that law might be relevant. The egg cracked. A snout the color of wet slate punched through. 10 minutes later, they were staring at a hatchling Norwegian ridgeback with smoke trickling from its nostrils and tiny black eyes full of prehistoric bad temper. It was impossible. It was magnificent. It was a disaster. The disaster acquired the name Norbert and a growth rate that made the next weeks an exercise in escalating panic. Hagrid adored the dragon with the doomed devotion of a man who believed affection could stand in for common sense. Ron, who had read more about dragons than was prudent, veered wildly between awe and predictions of certain death. Hermione took charge with the grim efficiency of a wartime quartermaster, cataloging everything Norbert would require and everything he would shortly begin burning if left in Hagrid's hut. Harry ran messages, smuggled scraps of information, and tried not to think too much about what would happen if Malfoy ever learned. Of course Malfoy learned. Harry came out of the library late one afternoon to find Draco leaning against the corridor wall opposite. Expression set in that infuriatingly casual way which always meant he had worked hard to appear so. "You smell like smoke," Draco said. "Hagrid's fire." And something else. Draco tipped his head. Something expensive if your eyebrows go with it. Harry should have lied better. Instead, he said, "Stay out of it." Draco smiled. That does rather make me want in. He followed Harry to Hagrid's hut 2 nights later and discovered the dragon by the simple method of looking through the window. Harry saw the moment fascination overtook good judgment in him. Draco had been raised on pedigrees and treasures, on stories in which ownership and wonder were braided together so tightly they could not be told apart. A dragon at arm's length overcame both caution and spite. He said, "By Merlin," in a whisper so reverent that Hagrid, instead of chasing him away, invited him in. That was how Draco Malfoy found himself feeding strips of dead ferret to an illegal dragon, while Ron described the Romanian reserve Charlie worked on, and Hermione explained, with mounting irritation, every possible consequence if the Ministry found out. Draco listened, and stayed. If Harry had been wiser, he would have understood that this was one of those moments upon which futures turn invisibly. Draco did not become kind because of Norbert. He remained vain, sharp-tongued, and perfectly capable of saying cruel things when cornered. But in Hagrid's hut, with dragon smoke in his hair, and wonder making his face look suddenly younger, he ceased for a little while to be only the son of Lucius Malfoy. Harry, seeing that happen, made the dangerous mistake of trusting it. The plan to send Norbert away through Charlie's friends was exactly the kind of plan made by children with enough intelligence to be elaborate and not enough to be sensible. It involved the tallest tower, midnight, a crate with air holes, and the invisibility cloaked. It might even have worked if Ron had not been bitten days earlier while helping Hagrid bandage Norbert's tail and confined to the hospital wing with a hand swollen to twice its size. Without Ron, Hermione argued, the risk was absurd. Hagrid wept into his beard. Draco, to Harry's astonishment, said, "We are already doomed. Might as well be efficient about it." None. Neville Longbottom, whose talent for appearing where he had been explicitly told not to be would have impressed a strategist, intercepted them on the way, and pleaded to come because he had heard Malfoy boasting and was certain Harry was about to get himself killed. They hushed him. Filch found them all. McGonagall's anger was terrible, partly because it was so controlled. 50 points from Gryffindor for Hermione, 50 from Slytherin for Harry, 50 from Slytherin for Draco, and 50 from Gryffindor for Neville, who seemed less troubled by the punishment than by having failed to stop it. The loss hit the houses like a plague. Gryffindors, who had only just begun to cheerfully reclaim Harry as an unofficial traitor to his own table, swung back into resentment. Slytherins were worse. Harry had cost them points. Draco had helped. The common room, once appraising and curious, turned in an instant. Voices ceased when Harry entered. Pansy addressed him with icy courtesy that landed harder than open hostility. Flint informed him that if Slytherin lost the House Cup because Potter had fancied himself a dragon smuggler, he would regret it in training and in every corridor thereafter. Draco bore the censure with a brittleness that frightened Harry more than ordinary anger would have done. "My father's written 3 letters," he said one night, looking into the fire. "The first told me never to be caught. The second told me to stay away from half-giants with criminal impulses. The third just said this had better not happen again." And Harry, who would once have envied any letter from home, thought suddenly that silence could be kinder than attention. Detention came on the heels of disgrace. Hagrid collected them after dark, Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Draco, and marched them toward the edge of the forbidden forest while Fang bounded unhappily around their legs. The moon was thin and red, trapped behind cloud. Trees crowded close as soon as they crossed beneath the first branches. The air changed there, turning wet and ancient, full of the smell of bark, leaf mold, and something blood metallic beneath it all. "A unicorn's been hurt," Hagrid told them in a grave voice Harry had heard only rarely. "Killed, maybe. We're gonna find it." They found not the unicorn first, but its blood, silver and shining on dead leaves in a clearing so still it seemed abandoned by time. Even Draco stopped speaking. Hermione's face had gone the color of parchment. Neville clung to Fang's collar. Hagrid frowned over the trail and split them into pairs. Hermione and Neville would stay with him. Harry would go with Draco and Fang along the other path. Draco stared. With him? Thought you liked dragons, Hagrid said. Forest'll be easy. Dragons, Draco said through his teeth, are not the same as whatever is bleeding unicorns. Yet, he came. The forest at night stripped all schoolboy quarrels bare. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Roots caught at their feet. Once something larger than a deer crashed through underbrush to their left, and Draco made a sound Harry would have laughed at anywhere else. Fang whined. The silver trail led onward, bright in the dark. Harry's scar prickled once, then burned. Then they saw the unicorn. It lay in a clearing, white as moonlight and twice as silent. Kneeling beside it was a hooded figure, black-robed, inhumanly intent, its head bent to the unicorn's flank. For one hideous instant, Harry did not understand what he was seeing. Then the figure lifted its face from the wound, and even though he could not see features beneath the hood, a wave of revulsion swept through him, so pure it seemed to come from someplace older than thought. His scar exploded with pain. He cried out. The figure's head turned. Draco seized Harry's arm with bruising force. Run! They ran. Branches whipped them. Fang fled ahead in a panic of yelps. Harry's scar hammered like a hot nail driven into his skin. He would have fallen if the creature behind them had made any effort to pursue, but it glided rather than ran, a horror with patience. Then hooves struck earth ahead like thunder. Something pale and powerful swept between them and the hooded thing, a centaur with hair silver as frost and a bow in his hand. The cloaked figure recoiled and vanished among the trees. The centaur turned dark, fathomless eyes upon Harry. You are the Potter boy. Harry could barely answer through the pain. Draco stood rigid beside him, one hand still locked on Harry's sleeve. The centaur, Firenze, he called himself, spoke in a voice so calm it made every word ominous. Unicorn blood would keep a person alive, he said, but at a terrible price. Only one who had nothing to lose and everything to gain would commit such a crime. Only one who waited between life and death might dare it. He said the name Voldemort not with fear, but with the grave acceptance of a star chart. Draco flinched as though struck. Harry looked at him then, properly looked, and saw that all color had left his face. The journey back to Hagrid passed in near silence. When they reached the edge of the forest and torchlight returned, Draco bent double and was sick in the leaves. Hagrid pretended not to notice. Harry stood beside him awkwardly, listening to the harsh catch of his breathing. After a while, Draco straightened and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, furious with himself for the weakness. Don't, Harry said before Draco could speak. Draco laughed once, without humor. You saw. Yes. That was... Draco stopped. His throat worked. My father says there are dark wizards, and most of the idiots who posture about power are only embarrassing. That thing in the clearing wasn't embarrassing. No. Draco turned to him then, and for the first time since they had met there was no performance in his face at all. Only fear, and beneath it a raw astonishment that the stories adults told for intimidation might contain realities worse than the stories. If whatever's under the trapdoor is for that, he said, voice low and shaking despite every effort, then no one should have it. Harry believed him. Perhaps that was the true beginning. Not dragons, not Quidditch, not the bathroom troll. A silver corpse in the leaves, and a boy raised on old names, discovering that some kinds of power do not care what name you carry. When Harry returned to the Slytherin dormitory that night, the green light from the lake windows seemed less like a secret and more like something submerged and waiting. He lay awake, listening to Draco's uneven breathing in the bed across from him, and understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that childhood at Hogwarts was a thin skin stretched over older things. They had all been playing at houses and points and petty loyalties above a hole in the earth where something far more ancient had begun to stir. After the forest, the end of term should have felt close enough to touch. Examinations approached. The weather softened. Students spoke of trains home and summer plans, and the exact degree to which older siblings might be manipulated into doing holiday essays in advance. Yet for Harry, the weeks grew only tighter, as if every bell in the castle rang nearer the center of something he could not stop. Voldemort, or what remained of him, was close enough to drink unicorn blood in the school forest. The Philosopher's Stone lay hidden somewhere within Hogwarts, and every adult who might have set Harry's fear to rest had, in one way or another, become impossible to trust. Their certainty that Snape meant to steal the stone hardened partly from evidence, and partly from the kind of pattern children make when frightened enough to need one. Snape had been bitten by Fluffy. Harry had seen it. Snape had questioned Quirrell in a corridor late at night, had spoken to him with quiet menace. Harry overheard another such conversation under the invisibility cloak, and came away convinced that Quirrell was too weak to stand against him. Hermione cautioned that overheard fragments were not the same as proof. Ron said if a man looked and spoke like Snape, proof was only a courtesy. Draco, listening, said nothing for a long while, and then remarked that if Snape truly wanted the stone, he would likely have taken it already. That slowed them. They were in an unused classroom, books stacked around them, twilight draining through the mullioned windows. Harry looked at Draco over a cracked volume on notable magical substances. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Draco said, folding and unfolding a letter until the seal splintered, "that Snape is frightening, not incompetent." Hermione, who had ink on her wrist and 3 library books open at once, frowned. "You think he's innocent?" Draco gave a short laugh. "I didn't say that. I said if he wants something, he tends to get it by making sure everyone else believes wanting it was their own dreadful idea." Ron looked scandalized. "How is that better?" "It isn't. It's simply more efficient." Harry watched Draco tear the letter in half. "From your father?" Draco did not answer immediately. Firelight jumped over the planes of his face. He had looked older since the forest, and not in any agreeable sense. Rather as if some polished outer casing had cracked and left the boy inside exposed to weather he did not know how to stand in. "At dinner on Sunday," he said at last, "I once heard Father tell a man that Dumbledore kept dangerous things safest by putting them where no respectable adult would stoop to look. Father found that very amusing. I didn't understand it then." "And now?" Hermione asked. "Now I think he meant schools." Draco glanced at Harry. "And children." Ron swore softly. They had gone that afternoon to McGonagall with the whole story they could safely tell. The dog, the stone, their fear that someone meant to steal it. McGonagall had listened with increasing disbelief, then cut them short. Dumbledore knew perfectly well what he was doing. The stone was well protected. Students had no business concerning themselves with it. 5 more words from any of them, and she would assign detentions extending into the next century. They had retreated, chastened, but not convinced. Harry knew now what happened when teachers did not believe you in time. The letter fragments crackled in Draco's fingers. "Father doesn't know I know anything, but if he guesses, he'll expect me to listen and keep quiet. That's what sons are for in some families." Harry thought of Privet Drive, of silence demanded for entirely different reasons, and felt a grim kinship he would not have imagined possible when he first met Draco in Madame Malkin's. "You don't have to do what he expects." Draco's mouth twisted. "That is a very Gryffindor sentence for a Slytherin." "No," Hermione said before Harry could answer. "It's a sentence for anyone with a conscience." Draco looked at her. Of all of them, Hermione had taken longest to tolerate him, and still did so with conditions attached. Her distrust remained brisk and unsentimental, which was perhaps why Draco responded to it with something approaching honesty. He said, "Conscience is a luxury in some families too." "Then perhaps," Hermione returned, "it's time someone began buying luxuries." Ron choked on a laugh he was not sure he ought to make. Draco stared at Hermione, then shook his head once with reluctant disbelief. "I have no idea how Potter tolerates you." "Practice," said Harry. "That might have been the moment. Had circumstances been kinder, when they became 4 children with a shared secret instead of a fragile coalition. But Hogwarts was rarely kind when kindness could complicate matters. The next morning, an owl arrived at breakfast for Dumbledore marked with ministry seals. They watched from separate tables as the headmaster broke it, read, and rose almost immediately from his chair. McGonagall's face tightened. Snape's expression altered not at all. Dumbledore swept from the hall, robes blue as stormlight, leaving behind a hush that was gone in seconds, but seemed to Harry to echo long after the dishes refilled themselves. Something in his chest turned over. "He's been lured away," Harry said that afternoon as they gathered again in the empty classroom. Hermione still wanted proof. Ron no longer cared about proof. Draco, leaning by the window with his arms folded, said, "If you're right, then it's tonight." Harry looked at him. "Will you help?" It was a straightforward question. The room seemed to narrow around it. Draco's gaze flicked, involuntarily, to the scraps of the latest Malfoy letter in the grate. He had told them enough by now for Harry to piece together the rest. Lucius Malfoy did not know specifics, but he knew rumors. He knew Hogwarts hid something valuable. He would want his son observant. He would not phrase that as an order because people like Lucius Malfoy preferred their children to internalize instructions until obedience felt like personality. Draco held Harry's gaze through a silence long enough to matter. "If I say no," he said finally, "you'll go anyway." "Yes. And if I say yes, there's every chance we'll be expelled, killed, or worse." "Worse than killed," Ron muttered. "Father would know I'd chosen against him," Draco said. That silenced even Ron. Harry had no clever answer. None existed. He could have said that Lucius Malfoy would never need to know. He could have promised that they would succeed without cost, which would have been a lie. He could have appealed to Draco's better nature, but goodness did not arrive in Draco by the routes it did in other people. So Harry said only what was true. "If Voldemort gets the stone, I don't think any of us stay children very long." Draco shut his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the fear was still there, but it had gone hard. "Fine," he said. "But if we're doing this, we do it properly." "Meaning?" Hermione asked. "Meaning," said Draco, pushing away from the wall, "that Potter stops improvising heroics, Weasley stops announcing his opinions at full volume, and Granger brings every useful spell she knows." Ron bristled. Hermione drew herself up. Harry, absurdly, almost smiled. The idea of propriety descending upon their enterprise now was ridiculous enough to feel like courage. They prepared as best they could. Harry fetched the cloak and Hagrid's wooden flute, because the giant had once mentioned that Fluffy fell asleep to music, and Hagrid would sooner have gnawed off his own hand than notice he had told them. Hermione packed bluebell flames in jars, logic in her eyes and worry beneath it. Ron declared that if there was a chessboard involved in any of the protections, he intended to be useful at last. Draco contributed a silver-handled penknife, several facts about old wards, and the simple, disquieting observation that Slytherin House was very good at teaching children how to move quietly after curfew. Night came. The castle settled. They slipped from their separate dormitories and met in the corridor near the third-floor staircase. 4 black-robed figures with pale faces and hearts loud enough to hear. Harry wore the invisibility cloak folded over one arm, not because it could hide them all with much elegance, but because it might yet prove essential. Hermione's hand shook once while she adjusted her grip on her wand, then steadied. Ron looked sick and determined. Draco looked as if he had been carved from something brighter and more brittle than bone. "Last chance," Harry said. Ron snorted. Hermione glared at him for saying it. Draco said, "You are never going to stop talking like a martyr, are you?" Then Filk's cat appeared at the far end of the corridor, eyes like 2 green lanterns, and there was no more time for speeches. They ran. The door to the forbidden corridor was already open. Fluffy was awake. The 3 heads lifted as one when they entered, 6 yellow eyes opening in the dark like lamps kindled in hell. The dog's combined growl hit them physically, a wave of hot carrion breath and sound. Hermione gave a strangled squeak. Ron reached for his wand and then thought better of attacking a creature the size of a cottage. Harry stepped forward because Hagrid's faith in music, however improbable, was the only plan they had. He put the flute to his lips. The first notes came out thin with fear. Then the melody steadied. The nearest monstrous head drooped. Another yawned so wide Harry saw a row of teeth like tombstones. The third blinked, swayed, and sank heavily onto the floorboards. Within seconds, the beast's breathing deepened into sleep, each exhalation stirring dust across the trapdoor between its paws. "Quick!" Draco whispered, because whispering made all terrors seem more manageable. They edged around paws thicker than tree trunks. Harry knelt and hauled at the ring in the trapdoor. It lifted with a groan. A smell of earth and green things rushed up at them. "What's down there?" Hermione breathed. Harry peered into blackness and saw only a tangled drop. "No idea." "Excellent," said Draco. "I always like the honest plans best." Harry took one last breath, set the flute moving in a wavering continuation by sheer force of hope, and lowered himself through. The fall was longer than he expected and ended in softness. Something damp and springy caught him, wound around his shoulders, and tightened. "Devil's snare!" Hermione shouted from above. She landed beside him, then Ron, then Draco, who swore brilliantly as the plant wrapped around his ankles. In seconds they were all tangled. Harry struggled and felt the coils constrict harder. "Stop moving!" Hermione snapped, sounding more offended than frightened, which was how Harry knew she was terrified. "It likes that." "That is not helpful," Draco gasped, trying and failing to remain still. The snare crept over Harry's chest. Panic rose sharp and old. The cupboard door, the suffocating dark, the certainty of being trapped while no one came. He forced himself to go limp. The pressure eased a fraction. "Light," Hermione said. "It hates sunlight." "There isn't any sunlight," Ron choked. "There's fire, then." Her voice shook once, then steadied. "Lumos Sol. No, wait. Bluebell flames." Small, cold flames burst from the jar she had clutched all the way down. The plant recoiled instantly, vines loosening with a faint rustle of something almost offended. Harry tore free, reached for Draco, and hauled him up while Hermione used a second burst of flame to liberate Ron. Moments later, they were all scrambling off the patch of writhing green onto a stone passage below. Draco bent double, rubbing his throat. "I hate," he said hoarsely, "things that touch back." "Noted," said Hermione, although she was smiling in spite of herself. The corridor led to a chamber bright with fluttering wings and sharp reflections. Hundreds of keys flew beneath a vaulted ceiling, flashing silver and bronze. On the far side stood a heavy door. Beside them waited broomsticks. "Flying keys," Harry said. "Groundbreaking," Draco muttered. One key, Harry knew at once, was different. Hagrid had said so of the trapdoor key. Old magic like the logic of patterns. He scanned the cloud until he saw it. Large, old-fashioned. One wing bent as though it had been roughly handled. "There!" They mounted the brooms. Hermione flew like someone who had learned rules for balance and resented air for introducing variables. Ron managed decently. Draco, to Harry's private satisfaction, proved elegant if not exceptional, gliding rather than darting. Harry went straight upward and into the storm of keys with the same joyless focus he had learned on the Quidditch pitch. The keys sliced at them in flashes. One nicked his ear. Another tangled in Hermione's hair and had to be swatted away by Ron. Harry tracked the bent-winged key through loops and dives until it veered suddenly toward the ceiling. He rose after it, cut across its path, and snatched it from the air. He landed hard by the door and shoved the key into the lock. It turned once, protesting, then snapped its own battered wings and tried to wrench free. Harry barely got the door open before it escaped his fingers and vanished back into the chamber. "Whoever designed this school," Draco said as they passed through, "was deeply unwell." The next room answered Ron's hopes and punished them. A giant chessboard stretched before them, the pieces taller than any of the children, carved in black stone and white marble. Torches burned green at the walls. The air felt charged, waiting. Harry saw Ron's face change. Fear remained. Something else replaced the helplessness. Purpose. "It's wizard chess," Ron said. "We've got to take the place of pieces." "How do you know?" Hermione asked. "Because if we try to cross without playing, they'll kill us." This, like many of Ron's insights, sounded at once appalling and completely correct. He took command before anyone could object. Harry became a bishop. Hermione a rook. Draco, with an expression of aristocratic insult, a knight. Ron took the place of a black knight and began directing them with a certainty Harry had rarely heard in his voice. On the board, Ron was transformed. All the second son doubts, all the resentments and jokes and wounded pride burned away. He saw 6 moves ahead. He saw sacrifice as structure rather than loss. The white pieces moved. Stone crashed against stone. Hermione gasped when a pawn split under the blow of Harry's bishop counterpart. Draco obeyed Ron's commands with increasingly visible irritation and equally visible trust. Twice Ron saved Harry from walking into a trap he had not even seen. Once Draco, on Ron's shouted order, took a white bishop in a move so risky that the Marble Queen turned her head toward him with murderous interest. Then, Ron went still. Harry saw it before he spoke. 3 moves from victory. 1 path. The White Queen poised to shatter anything that blocked it. "What is it?" Hermione said. Ron swallowed. "I've got to let her take me." "No," said Harry at once. Ron did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the board, on the impossible geometry of pieces and consequence. "That's chess. Listen to me. If I move there, she'll strike. Harry, you go to height. Hermione, you stay where you are. Draco." Draco's voice came sharper than Harry had ever heard it. "Find another way." "There isn't one." "There must be." Ron turned then, and whatever Draco saw in his face robbed him of reply. Not bravado. Not martyrdom. Simply certainty. The kind he had always wanted for himself, and only found here, on a board that demanded cost openly. "When she takes me," Ron said, "you don't stop. Promise." Harry could not speak. Hermione had gone white again. Draco's hands were clenched at his sides so tightly the knuckles stood out like stones. Ron moved. The White Queen struck with a sound like a monument falling. Her stone arm came down. Ron flew from the saddle of his knight and hit the floor so hard, Harry felt the impact in his own teeth. The giant piece dragged its weapon back into place, indifferent. Harry shouted Ron's name. There was no answer. "Checkmate," said the king and bowed. The door beyond swung open. Harry leapt from the board first. Ron lay crumpled but breathing, a thin line of blood at his temple. Hermione fell to her knees beside him. Draco knelt on the other side, one hand hovering uselessly over Ron's shoulder as if touching him might either help or prove too intimate for Baron. His face had gone stark. "We can't leave him," Hermione whispered. "We have to," Ron murmured without opening his eyes. "Go. Don't be stupid." "Melanie, and not and shout." The room after chess contained a troll already unconscious. Whether dispatched by Quirrell or one of the earlier enchantments they could not tell. They stepped around it numbly, carrying Ron's courage with them like a wound. The final chamber before the stone held a table of bottles and a strip of black fire barring the way forward, purple fire behind. A roll of parchment lay beside the bottles. Hermione seized it, red and visibly transformed. Here at last was a challenge made in the language she trusted most. "It's logic," she said. "Not magic." Ron made a weak sound behind them from the previous chamber. Hermione's mouth tightened. She worked through the riddle aloud under her breath, arranging bottles by size and color while Harry watched the black fire and Draco watched Harry. "There," Hermione said at last, lifting a smallest bottle and then a round one. "This one will get someone through the black flames. This one will send one person back through the purple." Harry reached for the forward bottle. Hermione caught his wrist. "It's only enough for one," she said. The truth of it dropped over them. Harry had known abstractly that he might have to face what lay ahead alone. Knowing and standing before the moment were different things. "I'll go back and help Ron," Hermione said quickly. "I can fetch Professor Dumbledore if he's returned, or Snape, or anyone. Harry, you have to go on." "I'm coming," Draco said. Hermione rounded on him. "There isn't enough. There must be another." "There isn't." Her voice cracked like a whip. "This isn't about what you want." Draco looked at the bottle in Harry's hand and then toward the room where Ron lay. For one breathless second, Harry saw the old battle in him, the instinct to advance, to remain central, to refuse exclusion. Then he exhaled through his nose and stood back. "I'll stay with Weasley," he said. It should have sounded resentful. Instead, it sounded almost calm. Harry understood then what Draco had chosen in the chess chamber without anyone naming it. He had not come this far only to abandon the wounded boy he had once mocked on sight. Whatever else Draco Malfoy was or would become, that choice was real. Harry met his eyes. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them needed to. Hermione pushed the round bottle into Draco's hand. "If he stops breathing this first," she said rapidly. "Then the purple fire. Then run." Draco nodded, white-faced and intent. Harry lifted the smallest bottle. "See you in a minute." "No," Hermione said with terrible honesty. "We'll see you when you're done. Now go." He drank. Ice flooded his limbs. The black fire no longer burned. It accepted him. Harry stepped through. The chamber beyond was quiet, and Quirrell was waiting. Professor Quirrell stood before the mirror, arised with his back to Harry, and his hands clasped behind him so tightly that the knuckles gleamed. He did not look around at once. The room was smaller than Harry had expected for the center of so much fear. Torches burned steadily in iron brackets. The mirror loomed at the far wall, its gilt frame catching the light. On the floor near Quirrell's feet lay a bundle of dark cloth. Harry's first startled thought was that Snape had finally been overcome and discarded like an old coat. Then Quirrell turned, and Harry saw there was no sign of Snape at all. "You," Quirrell said. The stammer was gone. So was most of the weakness. Not entirely. Fear still lived in the corners of him, in the damp gleam on his forehead, in the tremor at one hand, but it no longer dominated his voice. He sounded instead like a man standing too close to a fire he both worshipped and dreaded. Harry's mind lurched. "You." "Yes," Quirrell said softly. "I wondered whether you would come. I hoped it. Snape was a nuisance, but he was never the obstacle you imagined. He's been trying to protect you all year, poor fool." "No, yeah." Harry stared. The world seemed to tilt. "Snape? Protect him?" Quirrell smiled at Harry's confusion with something like pity. "He did his best to counter my little broom jinx at your Quidditch match. Admirable reflexes, but he hasn't my motivation." Quirrell's eyes glittered. "Do you know, Potter, how tiresome it is to be surrounded by men who think themselves subtle? Snape plays at danger because he knows the steps. I have had the honor of meeting danger itself." He turned back to the mirror and beckoned impatiently. "Come here. Look into it. Tell me what you see." "No, guy." Harry did not move. Every instinct urged either flight or attack, and both were hopeless. Beyond the black fire lay Hermione, Ron, Draco. Behind Quirrell stood the mirror that had shown Harry his parents and all his deepest wants. Somewhere beyond the castle, Dumbledore might or might not be returning. The room had the terrible stillness of dreams before one realizes they are nightmares. "Do as you're told," Quirrell snapped, and the weakness flashed back through the anger like a cracked foundation under a painted wall. Harry stepped beside him. He looked into the glass. At once his reflection altered. He did not see Lily and James. He saw himself, older by no more than a heartbeat, and yet changed, sliding a blood-red stone into his pocket, while the mirror Harry's face remained carefully blank. Then the reflected self smiled, small, sharp, secret. The image shifted again. For the briefest moment he stood in robes finer than any he owned, not Gryffindor scarlet or Slytherin green, but something dark and rich, with people turning toward him in fear and admiration both. Power, choice, belonging bought, not by love, but by consequence. Then the vision broke. Harry's actual hand jerked in surprise as something hard and real dropped into the pocket of his robes. He understood at once and kept his face still by a miracle. "Well?" Quirrell demanded. Harry forced himself to speak slowly. "I see myself shaking Dumbledore's hand. I've won the House Cup for Slytherin." It was not wholly untrue. Perhaps that saved him. Quirrell cursed under his breath. "Show me. Let me see." He shoved Harry aside and leaned into the mirror, muttering, his face contorted with greed and bewilderment. Harry edged backward, mind racing uselessly. Then Quirrell's body went rigid. A voice spoke, thin and cold, and infinitely more terrible for how little air it seemed to require. "Use the boy." Harry looked about wildly, but there was no third person in the room. "Come here, Potter," Quirrell said, and his voice had changed. It now carried strain of another kind, as though it were being pulled from behind. With shaking hands he began to unwind his turban. What lay beneath was not another head exactly, nor a face fully formed, but a flat, white semblance of one pressed against the back of Quirrell's skull. Red eyes, snake-like nostrils, a mouth too thin to be human. It was a face half-born and wholly hateful, and the sight of it tore a sound from Harry's throat before he could stop himself. His scar flamed like live metal. "Harry Potter," said Lord Voldemort. The name, spoken by that ruined mouth, seemed to dim the air. "You see what I have become," the voice whispered. "Mere shadow and vapor. I have found many means to sustain myself while I waited. Unicorn blood, the devotion of the weak. But the stone, with the stone I can make a body again. A life. A return." Quirrell's hands trembled under the weight of the presence behind them. Voldemort's eyes fixed on Harry with horrible intensity. "You were once almost one of my own, Harry Potter. There is more of Slytherin in you than those fat little school children know. Ambition, cunning, a will to survive. Do not look so shocked. The hat saw it. I see it too. There is no shame in greatness." "No, hurrah." Harry's fingers closed around the stone in his pocket. He thought, absurdly, of the hat's voice in the dark, of Snape telling him to profit from defiance, of Draco kneeling beside Ron on the chessboard floor, of Hermione solving logic while afraid, of Ron moving to be taken by the Queen because that was how the game was won. Greatness. Voldemort meant it as dominion, fear, inheritance of terror. Yet the children beyond the fire had all, in their different ways, shown him another kind. "I'm in Slytherin," Harry said, his voice rough with pain and fear. "Not yours." Voldemort's mouth widened. Perhaps it was meant for a smile. It looked instead like a wound opening. "Seize him," he hissed. Quirrell lunged. What happened next felt both faster and slower than thought. Quirrell grabbed for Harry's wrist. Harry twisted away. Quirrell caught his arm again, and where the man's skin touched him, pain shot through Harry, but Quirrell gave a scream far worse. Smoke rose from his fingers. The flesh blistered instantly. Quirrell recoiled in horror. Voldemort shrieked behind him, a sound of rage so pure it hardly seemed made for human hearing. "He cannot touch me," Harry gasped, not knowing if he asked or answered. "Kill him!" Voldemort screamed. Quirrell flung himself at Harry again. Harry ducked blindly and caught Quirrell's face with both hands. The scream that followed was inhuman. Flesh burned under Harry's palms as if lit from within. Quirrell thrashed, clawing at him, and every point of contact scorched them both. Harry hung on because releasing him seemed more dangerous than pain. Smoke filled the room. Voldemort's voice became a roar of fury and command. Harry's vision narrowed to white flashes. His scar seemed to split him open. Then the chamber itself tilted away. He was falling into blackness while someone far off shouted his name. When Harry woke, the bed beneath him was clean and soft, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender and potion ingredients. Sun lay warm across the coverlet. For one delicious second he knew only relief. He was alive, and the light was morning, and nothing in the room wanted to kill him. Then memory returned with such violence he tried to sit up too quickly. "Easy," said a familiar voice. Dumbledore sat beside the bed in a chintz chair that looked invented specifically to annoy him. His robes were deep violet today. Half-moon spectacles glinted. He did not appear tired, which made Harry suspect he had only just that hour stepped down from some battle with catastrophe, and chose to wear calm the way other men wore gloves. "Professor, Ron, Hermione, Draco. All alive," Dumbledore said. "Though Mr. Weasley will milk his injuries shamelessly for sweets and sympathy. Miss Granger is outraged with herself for not finding a faster solution to the potion riddle. Mr. Malfoy has developed an attachment to the hospital wing chair nearest his bed and insists it is only because moving him would be inconvenient." "No." Harry's breath left him. "And Quirrell?" Dumbledore's face sobered. "Gone. Lord Voldemort left him before I arrived. I'm afraid there was not enough of Quirrell left to save." Harry looked at his own hands. They were bandaged. "Why couldn't he touch me?" "Your mother died to save you." Dumbledore's voice, though gentle, carried the weight of old things. "If there is one protection Voldemort cannot understand, it is that. He sought to kill you, and in doing so marked you with the residue of a sacrificial magic both ancient and deep. To have been loved so powerfully leaves a trace. Not a scar of the skin only, Harry. A scar in the fabric of things. Quirrell, with Voldemort so close upon him, could not bear to touch what such love had marked." Harry swallowed hard. He had wanted his parents back so fiercely at the mirror that he had almost forgotten love might continue in forms other than presence. "The stone?" he asked. "Destroyed," said Dumbledore. "Nicholas and Perenelle Flamel have enough elixir to set their affairs in order. Better, on the whole, to die properly than to tempt men into this sort of business." Harry turned that over, then said the question that had been waiting almost as painfully as the others. "Snape." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled, but softly. "Ah, he was trying to save me." "Yes." "Why?" The old man regarded him over his fingertips. "Because not all debts are paid with money, and not all old grudges survive contact with the dead. That is enough for now." It was not enough, but Harry was too tired to push. He slept again. Later he woke to find Hermione at one side of his bed, chin high despite reddened eyes, and Ron at the other with a tower of chocolate frogs he claimed had appeared through no manipulation of visitors whatsoever. Draco arrived after dusk, pale and immaculate except for a bruise at his temple and a certain exhausted looseness in his shoulders that no amount of grooming could disguise. He stood at the foot of the bed looking annoyed to find Harry conscious. "You might have told us your plan included setting professors on fire by touch," he said. Harry laughed before he could help it. "I'll remember for next time." "There had better not be a next time," Hermione said sharply. Ron Chewin added, "If there is, I'm bringing a larger chess piece." Draco glanced sideways at him. Something passed there. Awkward, unwilling, real. "You were insufferably dramatic," Draco said. Ron snorted. "You stayed." Draco's face colored faintly, which seemed to irritate him. "Only because Granger would have let you bleed to death in the wrong place and ruined my shoes." "Of course," said Hermione. No one challenged the lie. It had become, by then, a kindness of its own. Harry was released from the hospital wing in time for the end-of-year feast. The Great Hall had been dressed in green and silver for Slytherin victory, banners falling from the rafters in rich folds that turned the candlelight emerald. As Harry entered with the others, the Slytherin table erupted in cheers so loud they startled even the ghosts. Flint banged his goblet. Pansy Parkinson clapped with a bright, fox-like smile that admitted neither apology nor defeat. Terence Higgs, from somewhere in the middle, looked as though he had swallowed a toad whole. Yet the applause was real. Whatever his sins against points, Harry had ended the year by keeping the house cup where it had stood, and by stopping a danger older than any school competition. In Slytherin, usefulness did not erase suspicion. It merely outweighed it long enough to drink to. Dumbledore rose when everyone had eaten, and the hall stilled. "Another year gone," he said. "Before we sing, there are a few points of a last-minute nature to dispense." A collective intake of breath shivered through the room. Harry saw Ron straighten. Hermione's hand froze on her goblet. Draco's face became unreadable. "First," said Dumbledore, "to Miss Hermione Granger, for the use of cool logic in the face of panic. 50 points to Gryffindor." Cheering from the scarlet table. Hermione went pink. "Second, to Mr. Ronald Weasley, for the best-played game of chess Hogwarts has seen these many years. 50 points to Gryffindor." Ron looked as if someone had struck him with a pillow full of gold. "Third, to Mr. Neville Longbottom for the courage to stand up to his friends, though in the event they dragged him into detention regardless. 10 points to Gryffindor." Neville's ears went scarlet. Laughter and applause met him kindly. "And finally," Dumbledore said, looking toward the Slytherin table where Harry sat very still between Draco and a jubilant Flint, "to Mr. Harry Potter for resourcefulness, nerve, an unusual refusal to let old stories dictate what choices are available. 60 points to Slytherin." The hall rocked with noise. Green and silver remained triumphant overhead. Gryffindor's added points had brought them close but not enough. Slytherin still held the lead. Yet the clapping at Gryffindor table, after the first startled beat, was genuine too. Fred and George loudest of all, Ron hammering his hands together until they stung. Hermione smiling in a rare, unguarded way. Across the hall, Harry saw not resentment but something more complicated and far better. Dumbledore's gaze moved over the room, over scarlet and green and gold and blue. "It takes courage," he said, "to oppose our enemies. It takes another sort of courage to resist becoming the shape others have chosen for us. I think this year has given us examples of both." "Aye." Harry felt the words strike somewhere very old in him. Beside him, Draco applauded once, twice, and then with more force, the motion sharp as if forcing his own hand to declare itself. Around them, Slytherin roared. Later, when trunks had been packed and summer hung at the edge of everything like an undeserved holiday, Harry boarded the Hogwarts Express with less dread than he had felt leaving it. He found a compartment with Ron and Hermione already in it, and after a moment's hesitation that was clearly meant to look accidental, Draco stopped in the doorway. Ron stared. Hermione narrowed her eyes. Harry moved his trunk with his foot. Draco sat. For several miles, nobody said very much. The fields rolled by bright with June dye. The castle dwindled behind them. At last, Ron offered Draco a chocolate frog with the solemnity of an international treaty. Draco took it, turned the wrapper over and said, "This does not mean I've forgiven you for bleeding all over a chessboard." Ron grinned. Hermione opened her book. Harry looked out at the summer country and thought of the hat naming ambition in him, of Voldemort calling that ambition kin, of choosing otherwise and finding that choice had not emptied him of Slytherin, but remade what the word might mean. He did not know what the next year would bring. He knew there would be darker things ahead. He knew the castle kept older secrets than one stone could account for. He knew, too, that the house into which he had been sorted in whispers and shock was no simple villain's cradle. It was a place of knives, yes, but knives could cut bonds as well as throats. It was a place of ambition, and ambition might turn toward protection as readily as power if taught by the right losses. As the train carried them south toward ordinary roads and ordinary cruelties, Harry put one hand absent-mindedly over the scar on his forehead and found, beneath all the uncertainty, a steadier feeling than he had expected. For the first time in his life, he was not waiting for someone else to decide what his story meant. He intended to decide it himself.